In this video, we will be discussing how to solve quadratic equations using the zero product property. Before we begin taking our notes, we need to remind ourselves some multiplication. So if you look at these three examples, I have different values being multiplied by something to give me 0. Hopefully you can remember that if you take any number and multiply it by 0, you will get 0. And that's a primary thing that we need to recall when looking at the zero product property. We will begin now using our Cornell Notes to kind of organize the process of solving a quadratic equation using the zero product property. So go ahead and begin by copying down these notes. Pause the video if necessary to make sure you get everything completed. So a couple of things that we want to underline is that the purpose of the zero product property is to find the x-intercepts of a quadratic equation. And in doing so, all quadratic equations must be set equal to 0. Let's take a look at some examples. If you look at these two examples here, you'll notice that one is written with parentheses and one is written as a standard quadratic equation. Both of these are quadratic, but we're going to use the zero product property to solve for x, which is going to be our x-intercepts. Remember our multiplication reminder. If we have two things being multiplied together and they're equal to 0, that one of them has to be 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to separate our factors and set each one of them equal to 0 and solve for x. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 4 from both sides and get x to equal -4. And then I'm also going to have x minus 2 equal to 0. Add 2 to both sides and get x to equal 2. Now these are our x-intercepts, so we are going to want to write it as a point, noticing that it's going to be -4, 0, and 2, 0. With this next example, it is not factored, so that's going to be the first thing that we are going to have to do. So using our generic rectangle and diamond problem, I'm going to go ahead and put our x squared in the lower right, our 1's in the upper right, multiply those two together to get -6x squared, placing our 1's or our x's in the bottom of our diamond problem, and think, okay, what two numbers multiply to -6 but add to -1? The answer is -3x and +2x. Now those are going to go back into our generic rectangle, and we are going to figure our outside factors. Now, hopefully you can figure that it's going to be 3x and x, 2 and -1. Now those are going to be our factors, and that's what I'm going to write here in parentheses. Now this is just like the first example now, and so we're going to take each one of my factors and set each of them equal to 0 and solve for x. So as you can see here, I set each one of my factors equal to 0 and solve for x. And so now the final step is to rewrite them as a point, because what we did find was our x-intercepts. So I have the point 1, 0, and our point -2 thirds 0. And those would be our two x-intercepts for this quadratic equation. So here's an example that you might see in a practice problem or on a test or a quiz, prompting you on what the problem is asking. So find the x-intercepts for the following quadratic equation. Now remember how all quadratic equations, when you're looking for the x-intercept, have to be set equal to 0. So that's the first thing that we're going to do, is set this quadratic equation to 0. Now because it is not factored, that is going to be the next thing that we do. So off on the side here, I'm going to make my generic rectangle and diamond problem and go ahead and factor this. So now that I have my quadratic factored, you can see that I'm going to rewrite my factors in parentheses and still having my equation set equal to 0. Here's where the zero product property comes in, because remember, if I have two factors and they're being multiplied together and they're equal to 0, that means one of them has to be 0. So I'm going to go ahead and set them equal to 0 and solve for x. So I'm going to have that x plus 4 equals 0 and 2x minus 3 equals 0. Solving for x, getting x by itself, I first get x to equal negative 4. Over here, I'm going to have to add 3 and divide by 2. And I get x to equal 3 halves. Whoops, let's rewrite that. So now remember that these are x-intercepts, so ultimately we want to write it as a point. So the first point is going to be negative 4, 0, and our second point, or our second intercept, is going to be 3 halves, 0. So here is a summary of our notes in using the zero product property to solve a quadratic equation. So the first thing you want to do is set the quadratic equation equal to 0. Factor the quadratic equation using the generic rectangle. Take each factor and set it equal to 0. Solve for x, and then to remember to write it as a point because that's what x-intercepts are. Now, here is one question that I'd like you to try on your own, and you will be submitting in your Google form later on.